Hello, hello. Welcome to a very special Blazor Community Stand-Up for September. Today we have two amazing guests with us, Dan and Mackinnon. And we also have our co-host, John. And we're going to be talking to you today about all the amazing new features we have for Blazor in RC1. So this is our first release candidate in preparation for .NET 6, and it has a bunch of amazing features that I'm sure you'll love to try out. So without further ado, let's start off with some brief introductions and take it from there. So my name is Tanay. I'm an engineer on the Blazor team, and we also have Dan with us. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm the program manager on the ASP.NET team for Blazor and our web UI technologies. So MVC, Razor pages, all things Razor related in ASP.NET Core.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Mackinnon?
Yeah, my name is Mackinnon, and I was an intern on Blazor this summer, and now I'm an active community member.
Awesome. Thanks, Mackinnon. And John?
Hi, I'm John. I'm a PM on the .NET community team, and I sneak into a lot of these community stand-ups. I'm happy to be here and get a front row seat.
Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us. So let's start off with some community links. This is where we essentially share a bunch of amazing stuff that's happening in the community. And from there, we'll go into some demos and some just seeing all the features that are, not all, but at least some of the features that are going to be coming in RC1. So thanks for sharing my screen. And let's get started. So the first link I wanted to share is, hi, John, is the ASP.NET community stand-up for the Razor editor. This is the community stand-up that happened a couple of weeks ago, and it essentially is the Razor tooling team talking about all the features that are coming in Visual Studio 2022. So with VS 2022, they have a brand new editor which has a bunch of enhancements from completions to definitions, to highlighting, new colorization, and a bunch of other stuff that should really enrich the developer experience. So if you want to give that a shot, that's available right now with VS 2022 preview, and it's sure to provide a much richer experience. So this is definitely something I'd encourage all the Blazor and Razor developers to check out.
I love the new code actions. Like
Yes.
control dot for a using statement in Razor is like, oh, finally we did that feature in.
Yeah, it really simplifies a lot of developer flows, and I'm really excited for everyone to try it out. Cool. Let's move on to the next link here. This is a blog post that talks about integrating GraphQL with Blazor. So for those of you who may not know, GraphQL is kind of like a query language. It's an API to actually access knowledge and do so in a declarative fashion. So this article talks about what GraphQL is, as well as how to integrate it with Blazor. So all the different packages that you can use, how to integrate it, and how it works well together. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this particular article is it shows how Blazor can work really well with other frameworks and technologies so that you can leverage the best aspects of each and create the best user experience for the end user that you may have. And moving on to the next one. This one is the Blazor browser extension. This is actually an open source project available on GitHub for you to check out. And it essentially allows you to create a browser extension using Blazor. So you can bring the power of C# and Blazor and Razor, all the great stuff that you may know and love already, into your browser extension to create a lot of really powerful applications. So the setup process is actually pretty simple and straightforward. So that's always great. And yeah. Definitely encourage you to check it out.
This is awesome. I'm really excited to see this. I played a while ago with creating a browser extension, and it's a bit complicated. And I looked at trying to do it in Blazor back then, and somebody had written a blog post in Japanese, and I kind of followed some of it, but it was not a super easy fit back then. I think Blazor was still like not at a place where it was super easy to do it. And so this is really great to see this. I'm definitely going to be trying this out.
Yeah, for sure. This looks really awesome. Okay. So let's go on to the next article here. This is an article that talks about actually creating a Blazor application, but doing it in a totally serverless fashion. So from the last community stand-up, I kind of discussed this with how you could put up a Blazor WASM application onto Cloudflare pages. This is slightly different in the sense that, okay, it's still a serverless application, but you can have full functions and so on using Azure functions. So the advantage of this is you can actually access databases and external data stores and do all that kind of stuff that you would normally require a server for, but in a totally serverless fashion. So for those of you who may not be too familiar with the serverless movement, essentially the way it works is that you have something called cloud functions. And instead of actually having a server that executes all the functionality, you simply ping the API, it runs the function for you and returns the result. So this can let go of a lot of the maintenance and upkeep that you may require for a project that you may just want to set up once and forget about. So this is often a great option for those cases, as well as, of course, a lot of production cases where you really want a simple, straightforward workflow that you don't really have to think about too much. And this is a great option for that. So definitely, if you want to learn about serverless architecture as well as how to use Blazor and serverless, you don't really have to think about.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so that's this article. The next is a new Blazor library called Habit. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but this is essentially for Bootstrap 5 components within Blazor. So if you look at the sidebar here, they have a ton of Bootstrap 5 components that you can try out. So I'm just going to hit the drop down here, and we can see a full drop down component that's made using Bootstrap 5 and Blazor. And they even provide all the code. They even provide all the code that you need to actually set up the component and just get working with it right away. So I love showing off all these various libraries for Blazor to show that you can use a variety of visual frameworks to actually get the job done. Yeah.
To get that one on the Awesome Blazor site. I don't think they're there. I was just going to check. If folks aren't familiar with the Awesome Blazor repo, it's just a GitHub repo where the community maintains a list of all things Blazor related. It's at aka.ms/awesomeblazor. And there's actually a really nice listing of Blazor component libraries there, and even like a table that the community maintains sort of comparing the different libraries and what they're capable of. This one, I don't think this one is there yet, but we should get it added.
Yeah, for sure. I believe this was actually just launched a few days ago. I may be mistaken there, but if that's the case, yeah, let's definitely put up a PR or something and get this up there. Okay, cool. And let's move on to the last community link I have for today. And this is the Blazing Chat application. This is a full chat application that uses a bunch of different technologies, to, including Blazor, to get everything working correctly. And this is actually a 35-part web series. So they have 35 separate episodes that goes through a bunch of different Blazor-specific features, from authentication to file uploads to virtualization and lazy loading and all that kind of stuff. So if you're kind of so new to Blazor, you can try out all or learn about all these various functionalities, how to use them, and you can get a pretty nifty application at the end of the day. So that's always a plus. So
Blazor and SignalR better together. I love that. Yeah, yep. Before, if you wanted to use SignalR from a browser, you had to do the mix of .NET and JavaScript. But with Blazor, it's .NET full stack. It's great.
Yep, it's awesome. And that's basically it for the community links. So without further ado, let's get on to the actual demos. So we have a bunch of really amazing demos that we've prepared. So Mackinnon, do you want to start things off?
Sounds great.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. So hello again, my name is Mackinnon, and as I mentioned earlier, I was just an intern on Blazor this last summer. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I added to Blazor and some other cool features that are coming to Blazor in .NET 6. So let's start with the ability to render Blazor components from JavaScript. So what's the motivation for adding this feature? Well, a big blocker for a lot of people from moving to Blazor is they already have a huge app written in Angular or React, and transitioning to Blazor would mean rewriting their entire application from scratch in Blazor. And so what this feature lets them do is instead add new functionality using Blazor, and then if they want to, start replacing some of the old functionality with Blazor, so they don't have to completely start all the way over. So there are 3 different ways to use this feature. First is what's shipping as part of the framework itself is this low-level kind of JavaScript API that lets you manually control the lifecycle of the Blazor components that you're using in your page, and then manually set the parameters of the components. So this is a very flexible way to do it, but it's also a little bit harder to manage. And for that reason, we created a Blazor custom elements package. So it basically lets you turn a Blazor component into a custom HTML element. So that way, the lifecycle of the Blazor component is tied to the lifecycle of the element's existence in the DOM, and then the way you pass parameters to the component is just through the HTML elements attributes. And finally, kind of the highest level of all of this is we've created the sample that shows how you can actually generate Angular and React components that wrap Blazor components. And this is something that I'll also be demoing today. So let's jump into it and show first how the JavaScript root components API works. So the scenario that I'll be talking about today is, let's say we're writing a very simple kind of to-do application, and we have the to-do list managed in JavaScript, but the to-do items are supposed to be Blazor components. So I have this very simple to-do item Blazor component here. It has 2 parameters, which are the index in the list and an event callback that gets called when the remove button on the to-do item gets clicked. And this to-do item also allows you to kind of specify the custom text in the to-do and toggle whether you're editing that text or not. So there's also some internal state management going on there just to show that that works as well. So let me go to my index.html. And this is just a very simple to-do app written completely in JavaScript and HTML. So we have just a button that lets you add a to-do, and we have a div that renders the to-do list. And when you click the add to-do button, it calls this add to-do function. And this is where we make the new root components API calls. So first, we just create a new element to insert into the list that will contain our Blazor component. And then we call blazor.rootcomponents.add. And then we just pass in the HTML element that we're attaching this Blazor component to. We pass an identifier, which I'll get to in a minute. And then we can also pass the initial parameters to the Blazor component. So in this case, if you remember, our to-do item had an index parameter. So we're passing in an index, and that's just the current length of the to-do list. So now back on this identifier, in order to enable use of a Blazor component using this API. In program.cs, you just have to call builder.rootcomponents.register for JavaScript, and you pass in the component type as well as a string that serves as the identifier so that you can specify which component you're trying to add. And that's what this identifier is right here. So once we add the component, we afterward can call set parameters, and that will update the initial parameters that we provided it. So here we're providing the onRemove callback. We're not providing an index, so it'll just retain the last index that it had. And one thing you might notice, which is pretty cool, is we're just passing a normal JavaScript function here, even though the type of the onRemove parameter was a .NET event callback. So what's actually happening here is the JavaScript function is being wrapped and sort of converted into a .NET event callback. And this is neat because it not only allows us to communicate from .NET to JavaScript by passing parameters from JavaScript to .NET, but event callbacks allow communication the other way. So it allows .NET, like your Blazor component, to send information back to JavaScript. So in this case, when the item wants to be removed, it can tell our JavaScript application, hey, this to-do item should be removed. And then the JavaScript application will update that list. So the final API call that I'm going to show is dispose, or method, I guess. But so this will actually unmount the Blazor application from the page, and then we just call set parameters on the items after it to update their indices. So once again, most people don't write JavaScript apps this way, but this is kind of demonstrating the lower level API and how you could use it. So I'll just demo this real quick just to show that it does in fact work. So
this means that like if you have a bunch of JavaScript code and you want to have like a button where you say in JavaScript, when I click this button, I want to actually render a Blazor component. You can write JavaScript code that says, yeah, sure, no problem. We'll render a Blazor root component right here. So you can integrate your Blazor components into existing JavaScript code instead of having to try and rewrite things wholesale or, create separate apps or have to, I actually talked to a bunch of customers there in this world where they have some apps that are like Angular and React, and then they hear about Blazor and they have .NET backends and they're like, yeah, Blazor, it'd be great. Oh, but now do we have to, if we need a common widget, do we have to implement it twice, like once for our Angular app and once for our Blazor app? How do we deal with that? This enables you to just write that component once and then use it from Blazor or use it from Angular and vice versa. It's super cool. And this is just the low-level capability, right, Mackinnon? This is like the framework level. We'll show the fancier stuff on top.
Yep, that's right. Just after this demo, I'll show how you can take this to the next level and automate a lot of this kind of lower level management. So yeah, but first let me just show that this does in fact work. So I'll click add to-do, and now we have this Blazor component that's being rendered. That's the to-do item. So maybe the first thing we do is wake up.
Zoom in a little bit. It's a little small. Maybe do a browser plus see. Whatever. Yeah,
Oop, how about that? All right. Let's add another one. We could say do chores. I don't know. And then maybe eat breakfast or something. So as you can see, I can click edit and confirm, and the Blazor component is managing its own state. But then if I click remove, that's invoking our JavaScript callback that will remove the item from the list. So wow. That's
there's some questions in the chat. Let me see if we get that add to do button at the top. When you clicked on that, that was JavaScript code that you ran that told it to now render a Blazor component. And the to do elements, those were all now .NET. Being executed in the browser.
That was all this.
Yep. Was that Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor Server that you were showing there?
This is Blazor WebAssembly.
So question, is this possible either now or in the future with server side?
It is, yes. Mm-hmm.
You can also register components for JavaScript from your Blazor Server application, include the Blazor Server script, client side, and then have render Blazor server components into the page as well. Both are equally possible. Same model.
Yes.
That is nice.
Okay. The thing I think seeing this, because this is mind blowing, I wonder about am I bulking up my page a ton? Is this like unwieldy? You know what I mean? Because I've got JavaScript, maybe components and stuff going on, and I've got the Blazor stuff going on. Is this? But I mean, when you're showing that, it was pretty responsive. It's not out of hand. I don't know. I wonder about that.
There is load time hit here, right? Like you're going to load Angular and Blazor, so yeah, you'll be for the productivity of being able to use both, you'll be paying the cost of having to download both. In the case of Blazor WebAssembly, in the case of Blazor Server is pretty light to download, right? Like the only thing you're really downloading to the browser is a little bit of JavaScript to set up the SignalR connection. So there's not a ton of overhead. I mean, there's still overhead because you're doing Blazor and Angular, but not a lot over what you're already doing with Angular.
Yeah, there's been some discussion on that in the comments, about like how small is stuff now and all that, and but people are saying with the like pre-trimming and everything, the apps are pretty small now. And I can see even if I've got a line of business application, or I've got an application that somebody loads up and works in all day, and it's mostly Angular, and I want to start using a little Blazor, like adding another a few megabytes in on one load, and then they interact with this thing, like in that kind of circumstance, it doesn't really matter in that kind of case. Yeah.
Some folks are asking how much Blazor gets loaded. Well, you're going to be running the entire component model, right? So you will need, in the case of Blazor WebAssembly, you'll need the .NET.WASM and the core framework libraries linked down to as small as possible in order to just support whatever component is you're trying to, or components that you're trying to render. But you will need to bring all that in. So you'll need everything you need to run Blazor to make this happen. So there is some overhead there. For some apps that may not make sense. You may decide, I don't want to pay for that. But for other cases, it's a way to start integrating Blazor into existing apps. And maybe if you're trying to do a migration strategy, you could start sort of whittling away at things. Both scenarios are possible.
It is funny too, because I get it, and I agonize about this on the apps I build too. But then I also see like a lot of apps are downloading many megabytes of images and special fonts and all kinds of stuff on first load. And it's like, well, like a few megabytes of actual functionality that you're going to be using in the page is often a small percentage of that.
For many cases. I mean, we understand that in some cases, like you're on a mobile phone with a slower network and you're really worried about keeping that load size small, then this might not be the right way to go have both Blazor and Angular. Like at some point that becomes too heavy for certain use cases. But if for like places where you have a great internet connection and it's really just not an issue, then this is a super productive way to go.
And like you're saying, the ability to not have to rewrite everything to start using some Angular, some Blazor with like an Angular application or a React application or whatever. Really cool.
But that's just the beginning, right, Mackinnon? That's just level one.
That's right. Level 2. Yeah. So this is just demoing like how you could use kind of the bare minimum, like low level API to get something working. But most people don't write JavaScript applications this way. They usually use something like Angular or React. So one thing I did over my internship was I created a sample that shows how you could sort of wrap up this kind of lower level functionality and create Angular and React components that wrap Blazor components, and kind of create this seamless experience where all you have to do is edit your Blazor component, click build, and then now you can instantly use it within an Angular or React project. So I'm going to demo that now. Let me pull up this Angular app I have. It's basically the Angular equivalent of what I just showed in pure JavaScript and HTML. But I'm only going to demo Angular today because the React demo is almost exactly the same. So you'll just have to trust me that they both work. But here we have this app Angular component, and we're rendering a to-do list just like we were before. And the only part we have to fill in is rendering the to-do Blazor components themselves. So let's go back to our to-do item component. So the way this kind of sample is structured is we have these 2 additional projects that we've attached to our solution, and they allow us to both mark a component as something that should be used in Angular and also generate the Angular component at build time. So the way we can mark this to-do item as something that should be generated as an Angular component, we just add an attribute called generate Angular. And now when we click build, it'll actually generate an Angular component for this to-do item. And then to actually use this item within our Angular project, kind of like we have this register for JavaScript method, we'll also have to call register for Angular. And we don't have to provide an ID here because by default, it just uses the naming conventions of Angular, which are kebab case, so all lowercase and separated with a hyphen. So once we've done those 2 steps, that's all. That's it. That's all we have to do. So we can go ahead and build this. And let's go back to our Angular application. And you can see now we have this to-do-item component. And it's a pretty simple component, but it has our index and our onRemove parameters that we specified in our to-do-item. And then it also extends this Blazor adapter component, which was also copied. And this kind of contains all the shared functionality for all generated Angular components. So if you really wanted to, you could just write this little bit of code yourself. But the advantage of generating it at build time is that you don't have to manually maintain 2 copies of the same component in 2 different frameworks. So let's go ahead and use this to-do-item component. So we will add it to our declarations list. And then in here, we can just render the to-do item. So we can do to-do-item. There we go. We have autocomplete. And that's another thing. That's another cool thing about using a system like this, is that you get autocompletion for component names and also component parameters, which I'm going to show in a second. So we can do something like, the tapping's a little weird. So if we start typing a parameter name, as you can see, we have index. That's the first thing that was suggested. And so we can specify our index, and it'll just be the current to-do items index. And likewise, we can specify our onRemove callback. So there we go. We also get completion for that. And for that, we have this function lower in the document that removes the to-do item. So we can just call that remove to-do item. And since this onRemove callback passes an integer, which is the index of the item we're removing, we can pass that into remove to-do item, and we can access that just with the $sign event. So there we go. That's it. That's all that we'd have to do. And now we can run this Angular application.
So that looks like an Angular component, because it is. That's an Angular component. But under the hood, that's actually a Blazor component, and you generated the Angular component around the Blazor component using the JavaScript rendering components from JavaScript capability that you saw before.
Exactly. Yep.
Wow.
That's right.
This is
so let's go ahead. Yeah. So let me go to the Angular version of this. And so likewise, if I click add to-do item, now we have our to-do item. And again, you can almost forget that was even a Blazor component when you're in Angular, because you don't have to think about the fact that it's doing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes. So, and once again, I can just type something random here, and then yeah, so it works basically.
All the callbacks work, all the by.
Yep.
So folks are aware. Like, so this was a proof of concept sample app that Mackinnon put together, and it's fantastic. This isn't actually like a built-in feature to .NET 6. Like the underlying capability of rendering components from JavaScript, that's in the box. We're shipping that. That's fully supported, part of the long-term support release, yada yada. This code generation concept on top is a sample application that Mackinnon has put out that you can look at and use as inspiration. It's not like we haven't productized this as a framework feature, but we're hoping that the community will take this and sort of run with it and be like, oh man, like what can we do with this? Let's make this like for really real, like really do all the all the features over Blazor components and make sure they have great projections into Angular. We're hoping that will be an inspiration to some creative community folks. But yeah, it's certainly like you can write this code. Like this code works today because Mackinnon wrote it.
How is that code generation stuff? So for instance, if community folks wanted to get in and continue to extend, where is that at?
Yeah, so that's in these 2 projects here, namely in JS component generation.build is where some of the component generation itself is located. So here, for example, we have this Angular component writer class, which is pretty simple. It just formats kind of the underlying representation of the component as an Angular component. It's less than 100 lines of code, so you can easily do this if you wanted to for another framework, like maybe Vue, for instance. So yeah, it should be very customizable, and you could use it however you want to.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
I was just to say that we figured that some companies that may have particular patterns, or some organizations and projects, they might cater this code style of code generation to their specific scenarios, to the things that they really need. Turning this into like a broad, like works for everyone all the time thing, that's probably a more ambitious project, but something that would totally be possible.
Yeah. And so if somebody wanted to do React, you would basically take this and adapt it using the React.
Mackinnon did React. Like you did React.
Yeah, we actually do have React support.
It's already there. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't clear with that.
Already done.
Wow, that was quick.
Yeah.
That's awesome, Mackinnon. I believe this should be the link. Should people want to check it out right now? And yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you. So if there aren't any other questions about this, I'm happy to move on to the next part of the demo.
Sounds good.
All right, sounds great. Let me so start this.
I'd be surprised people have opinions about JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks in the chat.
Yeah, so I do have a little bit more that I'm going to demo, and everything on this slide will be kind of combined into sort of one thing that I'm going to demo all at once. But I'll start by describing what some of these features are. So the first thing is the ability to modify the HTML head from Blazor. So previously, if you wanted to do this, you would have had to do the JavaScript interrupt calls yourself, like kind of manually, and that's a little bit hard to manage. And plus, it's very difficult to get that to work with pre-rendering. But this new feature works with pre-rendering, and it makes it really easy to manage. And this lets you do things like modify the title of your page, maybe add some metadata for link previews, optimize for SEO, things like that. The next thing that I'll be showing is working with the query parameters of a URI. So this will involve like reading parameters as reading query parameters as component parameters, and also writing back a new query string to the URI. And while we're at it, I'm going to show some kind of smaller HTML input improvements. So we have binding support now for date only and time only. And we also have support for multiple select inputs. So not just selecting one element from a select, but being able to select multiple or all of them. So let's jump right into it. So I'm going to do this a little bit reversed to my first demo. I'm going to show the functionality first, and then I'll kind of take a step back and show how it works in the code. Let me refresh that. Okay, ooh, it's a bit big. Okay, yeah. So this is basically just the project template for Blazor Server, but we worked a little bit to show some of these new features. So one thing you might notice is this little title up here. It says home, and I didn't just statically hardcode that as home. It'll actually change if I go to fetch data, for instance. It'll say weather forecast. So that's a dynamically rendered title using this new feature. But the meat of this demo is in the counter page, which is no longer a counter. It's this kind of mock flight finder application. So so the first thing that we have here is like some date inputs, and those are bound to the new date only struct, and this time is bound to a time only struct. So we can set maybe today is the departure date, and maybe we're coming back on the 22nd. Maybe I'd like to depart at 8 p.m. and then I can select maybe all the airlines. So this is the multiple select that I was talking about on the previous slide. So I can click search, and lucky us, there is exactly one departing and one returning flight. Nice. If I were to unselect maybe Southwest and search, so you can see that works. If I unselect Spirit, no flights. So while I've been kind of messing with the UI, there have been a few other things that have been changing. If you've been paying attention, the title has been changing dynamically. So not only can you like connect the title to what page you're on, but you can like update it from within a page. And also the query string has been changing as I've been changing some of these options. So if I like select only Delta, you can see the query string shortened a little bit. If I select all of them, it shows all of my selected airlines. So if I were to like copy this whole URI and paste it in a new tab, all of the inputs have automatically updated from that query string. So that's mostly it for the live demo, and I'll dive a little bit into the code and show how some of these features work.
That was a lot of stuff. Like that was like 5, I think, or new features or something like that. So that was the like modifying the HTML head, like you were modifying the title, right? There was multi-select for the select list, query string parameters, binding to timestamps. That okay. Like I just want to make sure everyone understands that there was like a ton of new things in that quick little demo that Mackinnon just like here's this all works. Let's let's go look at it now. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah. So I'll start with showing how the HTML head modification feature works. So so the way this actually works is normally when you have a Blazor application, you have a single root component that gets rendered to the body of your HTML page. And every Blazor component just gets rendered from that root component. But the way head modification works is we actually have a second root component that goes in the head. And then there's a set of components. Let me go to, let's say like index, for instance. So we have this like page title component, for instance, that will render to the root component in the head. And that root component in the head is called a head outlet. So if you create one of those well, I guess now it's layout.cs.html. So you see we have this head outlet here. And every time you render a page title, that content goes to this head outlet, basically. And then there's also another component called head content, which lets you put other stuff in the head. But I'll get to that in a second. So this might look a little unfamiliar because this is a Blazor server app and we have host and a layout. Normally, you would just put everything in host CSHTML. But now we've structured things a little bit differently. So if you want to use this feature in an existing project, you're going to have to do something similar. But new projects will already have this like updated project layout, basically. But what happens is our host, all it does is render the root component that goes in the body. And then we use this layout page, which contains everything else. The reason we have to do this, the reason we have to do it this way is because we need the body of the application to run before the head, because the app root component decides what content gets rendered to the head outlet. So if the head outlet renders first, it doesn't think there's any head content to render. And by the way, this only applies during pre-rendering, by the way, because everything has to be rendered in one pass. So we need the body to decide what content goes in the head before the head renders, basically.
To make sure I'm following this, we had a question from Egil, who works on B unit, and he was asking if this is enabled through JS interop. The way I'm understanding it is no.
No, it does not use JS interop, and the main reason for that is because that gives a lot of limitations with pre-rendering support. So yeah, this doesn't use JS interop. It does a little bit after pre-rendering, but for the most part, no, it doesn't work that way.
I mean, at the once you're dealing with the live DOM, there is a little bit of JavaScript to just manipulate the DOM if we like are setting titles and stuff like that, right? Like, but it's rendering a title tag into the head in order to make this happen. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, that's more or less how that feature works. Let's go to counter. So we have this page title in the counter as well, and this kind of shows how you can dynamically change the page title content, and it'll change the actual title, which is what you would expect. And like I mentioned earlier, there's another head content component where you can put other kind of arbitrary HTML and render that to the head. And that lets you do cool things like maybe dynamically changing style sheets and link previews and crazy things like that.
So some of you may remember actually that I think it was about a year ago, Mackinnon worked on this problem last year, right? You were working on head modification, and we put out an initial NuGet package. That one was based on JS interop. Is that right? And that's right. How we learned that, well, the JS interop approach has all these limitations. And so we had to have Mackinnon come back and do a revision, do an improvement. And so this is the fruit of that labor. Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, and I guess another thing that I didn't really show during my demo is that this does actually work during pre-rendering. So I'll just go ahead and show that it does in fact work. So I'm going to show the just the page source here, and this is kind of what the pre-rendering output would look like. So if I find the title, here it is. Here's our title, and here's our meta type that we rendered. So it does work with pre-rendering. Just thought I'd show that for the record.
Sorry. As far as source goes, those input elements, those are standard HTML5, like date and time and stuff, right? So I think that's like a forgotten and underappreciated thing, is that these input elements have their built-in support for date and time and all these and range. I mean, there's all these really nice HTML5 input elements, and they have full accessibility support. They integrate really well with it. So like people always are like running out and doing custom elements for all those sorts of input things, and it's great to work this way. And so anyway, I just wanted to call that out. Those are really cool.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, and so yeah. So one thing in particular that's new with these date and time inputs is that you can bind to the new date only and time only structs. So we have departure date and return date are both time only, which is a new thing. Are both date only, and then we have time only, which is what the preferred departure time is. And you can bind to those directly. And I also mentioned that we have support for multiple select. So if you have a normal like HTML select element, if you specify the multiple attribute, then you can bind to an array. So here we're binding to an array that's the names of the airlines that you selected.
Clap on that one. And I think that also works with the input select built-in component, right? Like it now will, what is it? If like it will generate multiple if you bind to an array. Is that right?
Yeah. So we also have a component called input select, and with that one, you don't actually have to specify the multiple attribute at all. It'll determine if it's a multiple select based off the type that you're binding to. So if you bind to an array type, it automatically makes it a multiple select. It's kind of how that works. But yeah.
Wow.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Thanks. Yeah. So that's mostly it for that. And the last thing I'm going to talk about.
One quick question. Sorry, but was it difficult to implement the date only and time only support?
No, not in particular. No, it wasn't. Yeah.
For people, since that is a new feature, what's really cool with that is it's always been date time, and we've always had to pretend like if you're only tracking a time, then you're like throwing away the date part of it. And if you're doing time math, things can get wrong if you actually have a date associated with something you're doing time math on and all that sort of thing. So this, you can just say date only or time only, and it tracks just one of those things.
Right.
And there's a big blog post about this recently, and they talked about naming is hard and how they went through all these different ideas of what to call them, and these were the best ones. So.
Yeah. I've just got to say that, like you asked if it was hard to implement. Let's just make sure we all understand this wasn't hard for Mackinnon. Mackinnon to implement. So take that into account.
It's definitely the Mackinnon show. This is amazing.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So, yeah, but I think that's pretty much all the show for the input stuff. I think the last thing that I'm going to demo is the query parameter reading and writing, basically. So if you have a Blazor component parameter for a like page component, you can add this supply parameter from query attribute, and now this parameter will be automatically populated from a query string parameter. So in this case, since our parameter is called return date, it'll look for a query parameter called return date and then update its value based on that. If you want to use another name besides return date, you can specify that manually by saying name equals, and then you can do something else like maybe return date in kebab case or something. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but that's only reading from the query string. Updating those parameters like from your code don't actually change the query. So in order to do that, we have other APIs that help you build new URIs with a modified query string, and then you can navigate to that new URI. So Navigation Manager has, for instance, a get URI with query parameters method, and you can pass in a new dictionary that has the new query parameter values, and that generates a new URI for you that you can then navigate to, and that'll update the URI. If you're not updating, sorry, go ahead.
Guys, just that get URI with query parameters. I think there's a singular one too, parameter. That took me a second when I first encountered that method, but that method actually will take the current URI of the browser and then tack on or basically add or remove or modify the query parameters based on what you specify there in the parameters. Is that right? It's going to give you a new URI back for you to do whatever you want with, but it's going to basically modify the query string of the existing browser URL and give that to you to then navigate to if you want to.
A few questions here. One is, if there are multiple values for a given key, does it just comma delimit those, or how does that work?
Yeah, so what it does is it actually just specifies the same parameter multiple times. So that's actually what we have with selected airline names right here. This is an array. And because it's an array, it'll have, like, for instance, airline name equals United, and then it'll do and airline name equals Southwest, and then it'll do like all of your selections just kind of as multiple parameters. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah. And then one here, just, like anything that's in the query string is not only viewable in the browser, but it's also passed along the entire way. It's in logs and everything. So you never want to put anything secure in a query string. You'd use a token or whatever sort of thing, right?
Security sensitive secrets. Yeah.
Yep.
Or anything that you then, like, you have to treat it also as a, untrusted input. So you make sure that you think about it that way.
One thing I learned, and I wouldn't rely on this, but one thing I learned a while ago that I thought was interesting is that HTTPS actually, I believe, query string and the path is also like part of the HTTPS end-to-end, like I wouldn't call it like it's not a full-on security, but it is encrypted. So, I don't know.
There was like a good question about like binding query string parameters to like a complex type. I don't think we do that, right? We only bind them to simple types. Is that correct?
No, yeah. So we only support like built-in types plus some other types like date only, time only, and date time, I think. So
basically things that have a string type converter style representation. Yeah. So there's no like, supply parameter from query and then you pass in like a product object. This is not a full model binding system. It's just I want this query string value and do some convenient conversion for me to the appropriate simple .NET type.
That's right.
But this could support, I mean, with those things in mind, you could support like deep linking or like bookmarking or whatever, because it does preserve all those query string parameters.
Yeah,
so for instance,
that was the demo, right? Like you like basically preserve the state of the form in the query string, right? So you could bookmark the
flight info or whatever and say, hey, check out this flight or something.
Yep, definitely.
And then question here about validation. Like, so it's going to bind those things in. Is there any other validation that, if it's either going to bind or not?
Yeah, so that validation is something you'd have to do yourself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It doesn't. There's no like data annotation based validation being enforced on these parameters, so you'd have to wire that up separately. It's not like a form input.
Okay. And there's a question if this demo is available or will be available. Everyone wants your code.
This specific part of the demo is not, but I could definitely put it on there if people want it. But the other demo with the Angular component generation is, and that's the link that was linked earlier.
Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, that's about it for me. If whoever's next wants to take it over.
So I had one thing. Like you showed rendering components from JavaScript, and you showed generating components for Angular and React. Did you show custom elements? Did we do custom elements yet?
I actually don't have a demo prepared for that, just because of time constraints. But
that's totally cool. I'll just
definitely link it.
Yeah. So in this next this upcoming preview in .NET 6 release candidate 1, which any moment now, hopefully, like I'm actually watching the live status to see like is it released yet? Is it released yet? And very soon, shortly, it should be released. On top of that same functionality that you saw Mackinnon work with, we also have an experimental package that you can use for taking Blazor components and building standards-based custom elements. So if you're not familiar with custom elements, like the HTML spec has an interface defined that you can use to create custom HTML elements, like natively in the browser. Historically, you would create those using JavaScript, but using this new Blazor capability, you can now create standards-based custom elements using Blazor. And we provide a experimental NuGet package, actually, that you can now use for that. The package is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.custom elements. So you basically add that package, and then you can register a Blazor component as a custom element. Instead of registering for JavaScript, you register as custom element, and then you can use that component as a custom element in any framework you want. Like you could use that with Angular, you could use that with React, because custom elements just work anywhere. That's kind of the nice thing about the custom elements approach, is it gives you a sort of framework agnostic approach to building some functionality that can be used in multiple places. This is similar in some sense to our support for Fluent UI. One of the things we did with a partnership with the Fluent UI team at Microsoft is they had already built a bunch of Fluent UI web components, custom elements, using just JavaScript and and HTML stuff, and they went the other way. They wrapped those in Blazor components so that they're easy to use from Blazor. So I guess that's kind of similar to what Mackinnon was doing with his Angular and React code generation. But now here where you can actually create custom elements using Blazor components. So that's something else you should check out. We'll have a blog post showing you how to do that. And there's a sample in the ASP Labs repo that you can check out that shows you how to do that too. Yeah, there it is on the screen. That won't be, you have to wait for the RC1 bits. I think most of the packages are now up, but yeah.
Soon.
Very soon. All right. Cool. Yeah, I can. That. But first of all, I mean,
Yeah. It's amazing.
we love having you as an intern. You've done another fantastic wave of improvements to Blazor. So thank you so much for your contributions and what fantastic demoing and presentation. Like, I should just leave. Like, you can do all the demos. You do fantastic job.
Thank you.
Really great. So thank you for all that stuff. I hope you guys enjoy that set of new features. We just had a couple things. It's been a little while since we talked about Blazor updates. There were a couple new features that I don't think we've had a chance to show in the community stand-up that we just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of. So I was going to show those really quickly. Let me share my screen. Let's see. This one. There we go. Okay. So let me know when you can see. I think you can see. All right, great. Let me get a little bigger. So first feature, I just going to show two quick features. One, I'm going to show the support for required parameters, which was, I think we did this last, where we showed new Blazor features in .NET 6 like in preview 4. So we kind of looked at all the new stuff that we haven't talked about here yet and cherry picked those. Required parameters is one of those. So required parameters is if you have a component, like here I have a counter, and I've added a parameter to the default counter that allows me to set the increment amount. This is sort of the first Blazor app that everyone writes when they're trying Blazor for the first time, it's messing around with the counter. And right now, the parameters in general in Blazor are optional. You can specify them if you want, but if you don't, then that's fine. And so this counter does have a default value that it specifies for this increment amount. So that just works. If I use the counter, like here, I've got a counter tag, doesn't specify the increment amount, but it still functions. Let me go ahead and run this so we get the app up and going. All right, so we've got our counter now on the home page. That works just fine. Okay, but what if we wanted to make it so that you have to pass increment amount? So I can specify increment amount here.
Dan, would you mind zooming in just a bit into Visual Studio?
That better? About that?
Perfect. Thanks.
All right, great. Let me put this back here. Oh man, I can never. My arrow keying with the Windows gesture is always slightly out. Okay, so now we've set the increment amount, and that's great. But if I don't specify it, like if I had another counter, that still works, but I don't get any help if that thing is actually supposed to be required. So you can add a new attribute to the parameter that is editor required. Okay, when we save that, if we go back now, hopefully you'll see that for my counter component that I'm using where I don't specify that parameter, I now get a nice little diagnostic letting me know, like, hey, this component really needs you to specify that parameter and you didn't specify it, so please do so. This is really a design time enforced feature. Like, it's not going to enforce that parameter really got set at runtime, but it's a great way to make your components more usable if you have a set of parameters that the users really need to specify. So you can add some diagnostics by just slapping editor required on your component parameters. That's required component parameters.
Dan,
yeah,
we have a quick question in the chat. Someone's asking what just happened. The code updated without a refresh.
Oh, hot reload, right? So this is .NET 6. Well, we showed this last time, so I assume people have heard about hot reload. But if you haven't heard about hot reload, we now have the ability, while the app is running in .NET 6, and this is not just Blazor. This is all the app models, Blazor, MVC, Razor pages, Maui, WPF, WinForms. We will take your code changes and detect them, and then figure out exactly the diff that needs to be applied to the running app, apply that delta to the running application, and then let the app just keep running. So in Blazor, that means we can apply like component changes, UI changes. We'll actually detect that the app got updated in that way and re-trigger a component render. So you can actually see the results of your UI changes in near real time. Like, it's super fast, super snappy. You need Visual Studio 2022 and .NET 6 to really leverage this feature. It also does work from the command line. So if you're on a Mac, .NET Watch now will, by default, try to do a hot reload. Not every change can be hot reloaded. There's some runtime changes that just can't be applied to the runtime the IL that's being executed, in which case the runtime will let you know and say, hey, that's a change I can't really hot reload. You're going to need to restart the app for that. With .NET Watch, you can tell it just to do that automatically, and in Visual Studio, there's a similar feature as well. So that's .NET Hot Reload. It's great. There are some, just so people know, with the RC1 bits, there is some wrinkles with Hot Reload and Razor with RC1 that you may see the plan is thinking that we're going to try and patch those soon after the RC1 and VS 2022 Preview 4 release goes out. So if you try it this week, you may get a bit of a bumpy experience. We apologize for that. .NET Watch actually works just fine, and there's some issues with the integration in VS that we need to get fixed, but we should have those fixed soon, like hopefully within a week or two after the RC1 release goes out. Sorry about that. You may need to control F5. I do have one of the fixes on my machine. That's why it works a little bit better. Okay, so that's required parameters. The other thing I want to show is the smaller app sizes. Like there was a lot of questions about, how much are you really downloading with this app now? With .NET 6, we've done a lot of work to try and make Blazor WebAssembly apps much smaller. We did this in a couple different ways. One is the .NET IL trimmer is much smarter in .NET 6. We annotated all the core framework libraries that make up .NET 6 so that they can be more efficiently trimmed, and then the trimmer itself just knows how to do more stuff. So .NET IL trimming is better in .NET 6, but even more cool is that there's now this tool chain that we ship, and it's integrated into Visual Studio now. So if I click on, let me go up here to ASMIC and web development, you'll see.
This is, you used to have to do command line, .NET workload add.
You can still do that. So this is a tool chain you can acquire from the command line by doing .NET workload install WASM tools. But now it's also available from Visual Studio. This is the new checkbox. So when you install the ASP.NET workload in Visual Studio, look for this checkbox, check it, and that'll give you all the stuff for doing ahead of time compilation. And what I'm going to show now, which is runtime relinking, where instead of only being able to trim the managed code of your Blazor WebAssembly app, we can now look at the runtime bundle, the WebAssembly bundle itself, and figure out, well, how much of this stuff do we need? Are you using all the globalization features in .NET? No? Okay, well, get rid of that. We don't need that to download that with the application. We can make it much, much smaller. Okay, so let's just show that. I'm just going to do this from scratch. How much time we got? We got time. So I'm going to create a new project. We'll do the whole 9 yards. This may take a few minutes, but let's see if we can do it all. So I'm going to create a new Blazor WebAssembly app. Blazor app 22 sounds great. We're going to host it in ASP.NET Core because I actually want to publish this app so we can see the full published download size. All the optimizations happen on publish. So if you look at the size of the app during development, you might be shocked and appalled and be like, oh my goodness, it's so big. No, that's only during development. We do all the optimizations once you publish, like trimming and compression and runtime relinking and so forth. Okay, so we've got our Blazor WebAssembly app. And I've got the tool chain installed. Let's go ahead and do a publish without anything. So I'm not going to do any additional configuration of the app. So let's do just publish to a folder, finish. All right. And then we're going to watch the output while this happens. Now I have the .NET WebAssembly build tools installed. So if this works correctly, on publish, it should detect that and it will do a couple different things. So there it's doing the publish. Watch carefully. So they're optimizing assemblies for size, and it's running EMCC. So that is the Emscripten toolchain for dealing with WebAssembly stuff. So that's the .NET WebAssembly build tools kicking in and looking at the runtime to see, well, can I take anything more out of here? Now, by default, it doesn't actually trim much from the runtime, but we can tell the runtime things to say, I don't really need this, and it will trim more. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, when I did this before, you warned me before I did my last demo to do this build well before I actually, don't do it live during my demo because it chewed up my computer for 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, so that's particularly true with ahead of time compilation. Because in ahead of time compilation, it's going to take the whole app code and turn it into WebAssembly. Ahead of time compilation does take a little while, so that's not usually something you can do with a live demo. With runtime relinking, because I didn't turn on ahead of time compilation here. I'm still going to use .NET assemblies and the .NET IL interpreter. The only thing I'm really asking it to do is please give me the an optimized version of the runtime when I publish this app. Trim the WebAssembly bundle as much as you can. Okay, so it looks like that. See, that's done. Like it doesn't actually take that long to do runtime relinking. AOT, that could take a little longer.
So, and there's a question. We do support AOT, but it does take a little bit of time.
Yeah. And again, that's a published app. Okay, so let's go and now find our published app, and we'll use this as a baseline to see where we're at. So we're going to look at the release build, .NET 6, and let's look at the publish output, and we will run Blazor app 22.server.exe. Okay, so we're running the published output. Let's get. I always do that. Whenever I copy from the terminal, it shuts down the server because Control-C is the gesture for shutting down the server. Okay, so let's see where we start. Let's always 5,000. All right, so this is a default, .NET 6 with runtime relinking. And let's make sure we clear all the caches so that we don't accidentally misrepresent the size. Okay, Control-Shift-R. Let's see where we start. Can't see the size. Okay, so right now, by default, we're looking at 2 megabytes. That's where we start out with the default Blazor app. That's with all the stuff that's in there. It's Bootstrap, all the features, okay? But can we make this better? So the runtime did get trimmed, but only got trimmed a little bit with the default setup because it's using still, it leaves enabled all the globalization features and all that stuff. Let's see how small we can make this. How small can we get this Blazor WebAssembly app? So I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to turn on invariant globalization. Okay, this is basically saying for this app, I don't really need globalization features like localizing numbers and sorting and all that stuff. I'm just going to use an invariant globalization for my audience. Some apps that may be totally impractical, but for a bunch of apps, this is totally fine. You may not need any of the globalization functionality. So that's one thing I'm going to do. And then let's also just whittle this app down. I'm going to get rid of app.razor. Let's only have a counter component. Let's get rid of fetch data and index.razor. We're just going to trim this guy down. Let's make the root component of my app be the counter. So client.pages.counter. Okay. And then what else do we want? Let's get rid of Bootstrap as well. I mean, that's just extra weight we're trying to see how small can we get Blazor, basically. So let's get rid of Bootstrap as well. Okay. Time to publish again. And let's see if we can do better this time. So we had 2 megabytes before was the total transfer size. Again, this will take a minute, but we'll hopefully see some improved results. So, one of the things that is a downside of ahead of time compilation is that the app tends to get bigger, right? You tend to get about a 2x size bloat on the app as you turn the fairly compact .NET instructions into WebAssembly instructions. And that's actually normal. Anytime you take .NET instructions and turning them into their native counterparts, you typically need more instructions to represent the semantics of the .NET instructions. But fortunately, with .NET 6, you start out from a smaller starting point. You have less stuff that you're going to get that 2x multiplier on. So that's goodness. So we'll let this just run. And
a few quick questions there. So this is not server-side. This is
not server-side. This is a Blazor WebAssembly app that's hosted in an ASP.NET Core app. I wanted the hosted version because I needed a little server to serve the file so we can actually see the what the transfer size looks like. Oh, crud.
So this stuff is still really hot off the presses.
Oh, shoot. That's because I have the server running. That's fine.
Oh, you had it already running.
I had it running. Let's do that again.
I've done this before.
One more time. Yeah. So it's not server-side Blazor. This is client-side Blazor running in the browser on WebAssembly, but we're hosting it in a ASP.NET Core server application. Okay, now we can try and run this again. Blazor server.exe, and hopefully, if I did that right, and pop up a browser, and we can go to localhost 5001 again. Okay, so we got a much more minimalistic app because we're trying to go as small as possible. Let's give myself a little more space. Okay, let's get the browser DevTools up. Application, clear the cache. That just makes sure that all the stuff that you cache with Blazor. And now we have a 1.1, almost about a 1 megabyte minimum Blazor WebAssembly application. So much, much smaller. And a lot of the savings is coming actually from the reduced size on .NET at WASM. I should have shown that before, but by default, the .NET at WASM is like 800 kilobytes transferred. But now if with all the trimming, you can see that it's only like 353 kilobytes. We ripped out all the globalization features are actually fairly heavy. There's a lot of data and logic that's needed for them. This allows you to pull all that stuff out. So much smaller applications with Blazor WebAssembly in .NET 6. That's what I had.
So you started, what was it before?
It was 2 megabytes is what we had when I just took the default project and just published it with the runtime relinking enabled. I think if you don't have the .NET WebAssembly tools, it'll be a slightly larger, like maybe closer to 2.1. With the runtime relinking, and if you turn on invariant globalization, you get down to about a megabyte. If you want to see a published version of this app, Anthony Chu actually put an app up for us all at minblazor.anthonychu.com, I think is what it is. I'll put a link to that in the chat, and you can show all your friends, wow, look how small Blazor is. It's only like a megabyte. It's a fully functioning Blazor application. John, if you could put that one up there.
Yep, I will do that.
That app's actually hosted on an Azure Static web app. I think it was Tanay, you mentioned like serverless Blazor applications. Azure Static Web Apps is a hosting solution provided by Microsoft on Azure for Blazor front ends, WebAssembly-based front ends with a Azure Functions backend. So full serverless offering with .NET front to back.
This is interesting. Steve, who was on before, so he said you can remove timezones.dat.
Yep, we could do that as well. Yep, that would shave us off another. He says 44 kilobytes, so maybe almost get us to the 1.0. I'd love to see that. Yeah. Love to see you actually get to a 9. I want to get to below a megabyte. We have other tricks that we're still looking at to further reduce the size. For .NET 6, we probably won't get to some of these other ones, but look in future releases for this size to get even smaller. It's kind of a fundamental for us that we keep pushing on how much smaller can we make this app size. We're looking at like different compression algorithms and things like that to reduce the size even further.
Wow, that's really cool.
All right, so I'll stop screen sharing, and that's let's see, is the release out?
Somebody said if you update Visual Studio, you will get it.
So has the VS released? Did they?
This is completely anecdotal. I have no idea. This is what they're saying. This is what the interwebs are telling me.
Well, the dirty secret, right, is that a lot of the release activity happens. It takes a little while to push hundreds of packages and all the stuff that we need to release in order to do a given .NET release. So that happens over time. So you can kind of see it start to trickle in. Like you might see things show up in NuGet. You might see things show up in certain blob stores and so forth. But I don't see the official release announcement yet. But very soon, very soon.
It's almost there.
On the .NET blog, look on the .NET blog, look on the ASP.NET blog, and we'll have details on the great new features.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. We have a couple more questions in the chat. If we have a little bit of time, let's try to answer them. So first of all, someone's asking if we can split the WASM into multiple DLLs. So I believe this is hinting at hot reload. Lazy loading.
So the DLLs are already split. I mean, those are factored files, so they can be cached individually and downloaded as needed. All the benefits of HTTP2 are really help you out there as you download that bundle of files. The WebAssembly bundle is the .NET runtime. Like that's the runtime logic for running those DLLs. That WASM module is a single payload, and it can't really be split. There's not really a good way yet for us to dynamically load multiple WebAssembly modules in a Blazor WebAssembly app. We have talked about it. You can imagine, people often ask like, well, can I do lazy loading with my WebAssembly ahead of time compiled app? Thinking that like I want to AOT everything, but I want it to be sort of in multiple chunks, and I only download the chunks as I need them. That's not a capability that we currently have. As I understand it, it's pretty much a limitation of the spec that just makes dynamically loading WebAssembly modules pretty difficult. So you always end up with one WebAssembly module in a Blazor WebAssembly app. It can be bigger, it can be smaller. If you AOT, it gets bigger. If you runtime link, it gets it smaller. But you pretty much only have one. For lazy loading, we do have lazy loading capabilities for the .NET assemblies. So you can mark individual DLLs and say, don't download this dependency until I tell you. That is a built-in feature. And that works whether you've ahead of time compiled the app or not. You can sort of knock out assemblies and say, that one's going to be lazy loaded. Don't AOT it. I'm going to dynamically load it. Now, those things are possible, but you can't do it at the WebAssembly layer yet. Maybe in the future. Maybe there'll be some spec updates and browser functionality that will enable that.
Okay, that sounds cool. Thank you, Dan. So if people have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. In the meantime, just wanted to ask, sorry.
This one I think is interesting, and there's different implications for this, but question about, secure CDN for caching the runtime. And I think some things are less simple about this than I had originally believed. One is, if like any kind of trimming is going to affect that, right? You've got basically custom builds of the runtime. And then also there's a lot less like reuse, like the browser specs no longer will support loading from CDNs and caching as much. So.
When we started Blazor WebAssembly, this was something we thought we would do, that we might have a central CDN someplace that people could reference, and then you could cache those files once and then potentially reuse them across applications. Browsers shut that down pretty quick. The reason why they stopped allowing that was because of all sorts of privacy and security concerns. So browsers now, even if we had a common CDN for the runtime, they won't allow that file to be cached and shared across origins. So that won't really help for like us to create a central CDN. But for your application, you can set up a CDN for your app and your files, and then everyone who comes to your application, they can get those files cached in the CDN layer and get efficiencies that way. All the normal HTTP tricks for caching apply to Blazor WebAssembly apps just like they do for any other static file, because the Blazor WebAssembly app is just a bunch of static files.
Okay, makes sense. We also have another question here talking about mobile Blazor. So perhaps they're hinting at Maui.
Yeah, Maui is still chugging along. So we didn't show anything new in .NET Maui or .NET Maui Blazor apps, but there will be an update for that along with the .NET 6 RC release. So look for that soon. The functionality, for the Blazor integration, we ship a Blazor WebView control. It's just a .NET Maui control that allows you to render Blazor components into an embedded browser control. That functionality is pretty much done. Like it's a fairly simple piece of tech. The things that are still moving around is Maui itself, like getting the single projects experience to be really good, so you can have WinUI and Mac Catalyst and Android and iOS all in one project that's multi-targeted. That tooling experience, the Maui runtime, all that stuff is still being heavily worked on. But .NET Maui Blazor is looking good. So look for an updated version of that coming shortly with the RC1 release.
I think this is a good question here. So how do we handle a big app with 100+ pages? And I think going along with that, we're looking at a very simple app with a couple of pages and it's a megabyte. So how do we scale up size-wise as well when you get to large applications?
Well, the first thing is that you might be surprised at how little additional overhead those 100 pages have. Like .NET IL itself is actually really compact. The big part of a Blazor WebAssembly app isn't really your app. Like your code is actually pretty small. The stuff that is the bulk of the weight is the WebAssembly runtime itself and the core framework libraries. And those get downloaded once and they're kind of just there. As you add more pages, the additional size increase is actually usually pretty small. It depends a little bit on what dependency chain you have. Like if you go find a megabyte DLL and decide to depend on that from your Blazor WebAssembly app, well, you're going to have to download a megabyte DLL. So think hard about the size of your dependencies before you take them when doing Blazor WebAssembly. That's just the nature of the game once you're now in this mode of downloading the app to the browser. But the actual like components of like writing a counter, it's tiny. Like it's a teeny tiny little piece. A couple kilobytes is what you're really normally talking about there. If you do need to break it up into islands, like I said, you can do lazy loading of the assemblies themselves. So if you do have a big dependency, you can say, please don't load that up front. I will tell you when to load it. Only when I browse to this page is when I need it. And so that's when you'll take the hit for downloading that library. And in general, for community dependencies, I would encourage folks to look at the blogs on the .NET blog about .NET IL trimming and linkability of your assemblies. There are things that anyone who owns a library can do to annotate your library to make it much more friendly to the trimmer. So when we run the .NET IL trimmer, we can much more efficiently trim your dependencies in addition to the actual app itself. So that's another thing that we need the community to start really looking at, is thinking about the trimmability of their assemblies.
One other one I wanted a question that's I think is related, because can you use APIs with Blazor? Absolutely, and that's how our .NET Live TV page in the .NET site works. Is we actually have a Blazor WebAssembly client, and it's calling into backend APIs that are interacting with YouTube APIs and functions and all this other stuff. And so that is a really good way to kind of factor your applications. And that takes away the requirement for having all these other libraries and, not just the code, but also the dependencies. And then also, I think, we're talking specifically about Blazor WebAssembly, but Blazor Server also, as you mentioned before, Dan, it's like much smaller download because you're executing that code on the server.
Like maybe 100 kilobytes to download the app, and that's it. Like it never gets bigger, because all your code stays on the server. So you can write 1 million pages if you want, and your app size will never increase with the Blazor Server app. In general, I would actually recommend folks start out with Blazor Server because it will simplify a lot of your app development concerns. Like you don't have to create APIs for a lot of stuff because, well, you're already on the server. You can access all the server resources. You're right there. Blazor Server is really a great solution. If you need to push the load of your app down to the client, then Blazor WebAssembly makes a lot of sense. And fortunately, the component model is the same, so you can just flip your components over to be Blazor WebAssembly. But Blazor Server is definitely worth a look. It loads very fast. Execution speed is great because you're running on a JIT-based runtime on the server. The main downsides are like the latency of the connection. Like if you have low latency requirements for your application, Blazor Server may not work very well because there's only so much we can do about the speed of light. But for many scenarios, Blazor Server is great.
Yeah.
This question: will it be possible to start with Blazor Server and then move to WASM? So first of all, as part of managing your app, of course, like you can start with a Blazor Server app and then flip it to be Blazor WebAssembly. But maybe what they're asking here is actually like a runtime. Like, what if I start out as a Blazor Server app and then download the Blazor WebAssembly runtime in the background and then flip it to be a Blazor WebAssembly app on the fly? That's something that we've been talking a little bit about. Maybe something that we'll look at for .NET 7. So we don't ship a feature like that out of the box, but conceptually should be doable. You just need a way to manage the state, right? Like you need to know, I've established some state with the Blazor Server app. I need a good way to transfer that over now to the Blazor WebAssembly app.
Mm-hmm. And then as far as the, starting with the Blazor Server application and switching to Blazor WebAssembly, there's two parts to that answer, I think, right? Because it's actually just a few lines of code that you're changing in your application. But if you've taken those dependencies, if you're assuming you're on the server and you're calling directly into a database and all these sorts of things, then you need to refactor that a bit.
Yeah, you'll want to do that refactoring anyway. Like you should decouple your UI components from things like access to data and those types. That's just good for testability regardless. So you'll want to do that regardless.
Okay, that's awesome. That's just about the time we have for today. So let's, first of all, thank you so much, Dan and Mackinnon, for joining us today. So many amazing and exciting features that are going to be coming to RC1. And as Dan mentioned, it will be coming very, very, very soon. Hopefully within the next hour or two, everything should be live and everyone should be able to try it out. And yeah, so thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mackinnon. And thank you so much, John, as well, for coming on.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for all the great questions and stuff too.
Thank you, Mackinnon. Best intern ever.
Best team ever.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, folks.